the FCC is not threatening to throw anybody in jail. It's not what they
are
do.
you denying that Brendan Carr did not issue a threat in the fall to ABC or to Disney that they
Chairman
would
Carr's
review?
letter in March 2025
Joe, simple question. Did Brendan Carr in the fall say that he would take a look at Disney's FCC licenses because of the comments that Jimmy Kimmel made?
I don't remember, but I can tell you what he put in writing.
I can tell you. Hold on a second. I can tell you. He did say that. So given that he said that, do you acknowledge that that's him using his power as a government entity to try to coerce the actions of a private company?
In today's video, Abby Phillip schools and fact-checks Joe Borelli on Newsnight with Abby Phillip. When government pressure starts creeping into what comedians or networks can say, that raises serious First Amendment concerns. That's where Abby's argument really stands out. This isn't just about Jimmy Kimmel. It's about protecting free speech from political influence. So let's dive in and watch how Abby Phillip shuts down Joe Borelli on Newsnight with Abby Phillip.
The several attacks that have happened directed at Donald Trump are egregious. It's shaken me quite a bit, honestly, to think that in the United States, in the year of our Lord 2026, people are taking shots at the president. And this is disconcerting. At the same time, it doesn't seem appropriate to me that the response from the administration is, well, let's start cracking down on everyone who is saying anything directed at the president, even if it has no connection whatsoever to an assassination plot. So that, to me, again, smacks of pettiness. It seems vindictive. And again, it runs afoul of our laws. If there is a legitimate concern about systematic discrimination on the part of broadcasters here, the FCC would pretty much have grounds to go after every broadcaster in America related to DEI policies.
Including, by the way, Fox, which has DEI policies.
Absolutely.
Just like all the other networks. Yeah. But anyway,
so
Ellie.
Private entities have the right to fire people if they want, if they don't like that person's speech. But the real fundamental question here has to do with governmental power. Do we want the FCC policing the content of speech? Because that's a totally different thing. The First Amendment applies to governmental action. It doesn't apply directly to ABC. And so if the FCC is throwing its governmental weight around to try to influence speech, to try to punish certain speech, that is where the First Amendment is violated.
Punish, throw your weight around, going back to the first segment. When you talk about regulation, if the biggest thing that's changed since Ronald Reagan's horrible assassination attempt at that same hotel, and we were talking about it in the break, is the internet. Things now on the internet make us want to hate each other because we're team red or team blue because it makes people literally rich.
For a while, it seemed that the free speech argument was the argument being made on the right by people like Elon Musk, by people like J.D. Vance, who last year went to Europe and lectured them about protecting free speech. Listen.
In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat. So I come here today not just with an observation, but with an offer. And just as the Biden administration seemed desperate to silence people for speaking their minds, so the Trump administration will do precisely the opposite, and I hope that we can work together on that. In Washington, there is a new sheriff in town, and under Donald Trump's leadership, we may disagree with your views, but we will fight to defend your right to offer it in the public square.
Unless you are a late-night comedian, Jimmy Kimmel, Stephen Colbert, or frankly anybody who criticizes President Trump, they won't defend your right to say things they disagree with then.
Now, historically, the line has been pretty clear. The First Amendment protects even harsh, offensive, or political criticism. The Supreme Court of the United States reinforced that in cases like Brandenburg versus Ohio, where they ruled that speech can only be restricted if it's directly inciting imminent lawless action. That's a high bar on purpose, because once you lower it, it becomes really easy for governments to start labeling criticism as dangerous. And the concern about agencies like the Federal Communications Commission stepping into content regulation isn't new either. Legal scholars have warned for years that even informal pressure, what people call jawboning, can chill speech just as effectively as outright censorship. You don't need to ban something outright if companies feel they might get punished for allowing it. What's also interesting is how this ties into the modern media environment. Platforms today are driven by engagement, and outrage travels faster than nuance. research from places like Pew Research Center shows that highly partisan content gets amplified more because it keeps people clicking. That creates a cycle where rhetoric escalates, which then leads to calls for more control, and the whole thing feeds itself. And then there's the consistency issue. You've got politicians across the spectrum who champion free speech when it benefits them, but shift pretty quickly when the criticism is aimed their way. That kind of selective defense is exactly what erodes trust over time. That's why the perspective here makes sense. You can take threats seriously and still draw a firm line against expanding government power over speech, because once that line starts to blur, it rarely gets redrawn in a way that favors the public.
Oh, but the president's not prosecuting, Jimmy Kimmel. He's saying he should be fired, and that could be his opinion. If you joked about someone's death, which he believed he did, go ahead, criticize him.
Government doesn't necessarily.
So he's using the government to bring something that they brought in March of 2025. They started this in March of 2025.
You can use the government's regulatory power. I'm not talking just about this, because don't forget
that was the leading.
Brandon Carr made this threat first last fall. So the threat of using the government's regulatory power to police speech and police the actions of private corporations, that has been unequivocally put on the table. And I'm not the hold on a second. I am not the only
letter is about the DEI policies.
I am not the only person saying that. Here's Ted Cruz today. He says it is not the government's job to censor. I do not believe the FCC should operate as the speech police. Ted Cruz. He is no
I would ask you and Ted Cruz.
Hater. He's no rhino. He believes that this action, and he was consistent. The last comments by Brendan Carr, he was very clear that he believed that was a clear evidence of jawboning, which is using the threat to coerce speech. So it doesn't require that you throw somebody in jail. Just the threat of using regulatory power to coerce their actions
getting threatened.
Is what is happening.
To be clear, the FCC is not threatening to throw anybody in jail. It's not.
So, are you denying that Brendan Carr did not issue a threat in the fall to ABC or to Disney that they would review?
Letter in March 2025.
Joe, simple question: did Brendan Carr in the fall say that he would take a look at Disney's FCC licenses because of the comments that Jimmy Kimmel made?
I don't remember, but I can tell you what he's
I can tell you. Hold on a second. I can tell you. He did say that. So given that he said that, do you acknowledge that that's him using his power as a government entity to try to coerce the actions of a private company?
You are trying to stretch something that is on paper that you can read with your own eyes and see. The chairman's letter involves Disney's DEI policies, which the FCC has been regulating equal employment practices since something like 1968 or 1969. Every time a license gets renewed, they have to apply the same standards to everybody. And one of those standards is employment practices. If Disney has...
I mean, it's a good question. Why aren't they applying this standard across the board?
Well, when they get their license renewed, they will.
Well, hold on.
But if Disney has nothing to hide about their employment practices,
no, Disney's licenses are not up for renewal.
They're up in 2028.
Yeah, but they are not up for renewal right now.
The way we are talking about this at this table, all of us, exposes that this is a pretext piled atop another pretext. Absolutely. We all know this is not about DEI policies. We're not even really talking about it this way. We know it's about the content of speech. We know it's about the jokes Jimmy Kimmel made. We know it's about the kind of things that he says. That's what's prompting all of this.
I would have made it about DEI. I got interrupted 20 times.
Which broadcaster hasn't?
Sure, a president can say whatever they want about a comedian. That's not illegal. But once you start bringing in agencies like the Federal Communications Commission, it's a completely different ballgame. That's where Abby and Ellie's side is coming from. And legally, they've got history backing them up. There's actually a long-standing concern in constitutional law about something called jawboning, where officials don't outright censor speech but apply pressure behind the scenes. Courts have warned that even indirect threats, like hinting at license reviews or regulatory scrutiny, can violate the First Amendment if they're meant to punish certain viewpoints. Cases like Bantam Books v. Sullivan made it clear that the government doesn't need to ban speech outright to cross the line. Coercion alone can be enough. And the DEI argument being used here, that's where things start to look shaky. The FCC does review employment practices, but typically during license renewals. not as a reaction to a specific piece of content. Even conservative voices like Ted Cruz have pushed back on this kind of move, saying the FCC shouldn't act like a speech police. That's a pretty big signal that this isn't just a partisan complaint. The bigger issue is consistency. If every network from ABC to others has similar internal policies, but only one gets scrutiny right after a controversial joke, it starts to look less like regulation and more like retaliation. That's why Abby and Ely's position lands. This isn't about defending one comedian. It's about whether the government can use its power to quietly steer what private companies allow people to say. Because once that door opens, it doesn't just stop at late night TV.
Made commitments to do this
Disney
kind of
has a
DEI
policy
hiring.
that 50% of,
Which,
of
do
their
you know
characters
any
and producers
broadcaster
have
that
to be,
hasn't done this?
Underrepresented groups.
Do you know
That's
of
a
any
DEI
broadcaster that hasn't made similar commitments since 2020?
No, and when their licenses get renewed, I imagine
But the license
FCC
isn't up for renewal. What we know is that the process was actually expedited here. In fact, it seems as though they've expedited the process in the last couple of days. Why do you suspect that happened?
The process began in March of 2025. It was done over the last year. You pointed out something that happened in the fall. So this has been ongoing for
I'm asking you why
now.
they're expediting now.
I'm just telling you that there is a ongoing inquiry by the FCC. And if Disney has nothing to hide about their DEI policies,
the answer is not convenient.
I don't think it's. I don't think it's in good faith to suggest that things that happened in recent history that were big stories at the time didn't happen. They happened, right? We know that Brendan Carr's threats to Disney that was the big story. And he was crystal clear about it. Even Republicans had to rebuke him. And that's why they ultimately backed down and they put Jimmy Kimmel back on the air. So we can't pretend like that didn't happen. We can't pretend that that's not the context. We also can't pretend that the context isn't that Trump has specifically asked and told ABC that they should take Kimmel off the air. So all of that, Joe, I mean, if you're being honest.
You're forgetting that Disney has
Joe,
been
hold on.
in the bullseye of the Republican Party since Ron DeSantis 5 years ago. I mean, this is not a company that Republicans have shied away from attacking.
If you're being honest, I think my final question to you is just sort of like in the last segment when we were talking about this. Do you really believe that this is the proper use of the federal government? You are a conservative.
The FCC.
J.D. Vance said, we will protect your right to say things we don't like. Is it the right use of the government for the FCC chairman to threaten a private company over speech that the president doesn't like?
The FCC chairman put in writing a question about DEI policies, which they have jurisdiction to oversee. If Disney does not have anything to hide about the DEI policies, go through the
What about his
Disney? By the way, Disney has said we're going to comply. Disney has said we're going to comply. You're right, Chairman. We're going to comply.
What about Carr's threats in the fall? Good use of.
I don't remember. I honestly don't remember.
Well, I'm telling you that it happened. Good use of his time or bad use of his time?
Maybe a bad
good use of the government.
It doesn't preclude the fact.
I'm just asking. Listen, Joe. All I'm getting at is honesty. That's all I'm getting.
I'm quoting from a letter.
Hold on a second. All I'm getting at is, can we be honest brokers at this table? Can we call a spade a spade? If you're a conservative and you have fundamental beliefs about the role of government, about free speech, can you apply those even when you like the president?
Conservatives are in favor of applying equal employment laws to companies.
And this looks like selective enforcement because every single broadcaster has these DEI policies.
We know what the answer to that question is.
Now, on paper, yes, the Federal Communications Commission does have authority to review certain employment practices tied to broadcast licenses. But here's the catch. Those reviews usually happen during scheduled renewal cycles, not suddenly accelerated right after a political controversy. That timing matters, and courts have historically looked at timing as a key indicator of intent. There's also the bigger pattern. After 2020, a huge number of major companies, including media networks, adopted some form of diversity initiatives. This isn't unique to one company like Disney. So if enforcement suddenly focuses on one specific company, especially after a public dispute involving someone like Jimmy Kimmel, it raises a pretty obvious question. Why this one and why now? That's where the idea of selective enforcement comes in, which courts have flagged as a potential constitutional problem. Even if a government agency technically has authority, using it unevenly, especially tied to speech, can cross into First Amendment territory. That's why even conservatives, including figures like Ted Cruz, have warned against turning regulators into de facto speech police. And historically, this isn't new. The US has had multiple moments where government officials tried to pressure the media indirectly instead of outright censoring them. Legal scholars often point back to cases like Bantam Books v. Sullivan, which made it clear that informal pressure can still violate free speech protections. That's why Abby and Camille's side hits. It's not about whether DEI policies can be reviewed. It's about whether that review is being used as a pretext to go after speech someone in power doesn't like. Because if the rules only get enforced when it's politically convenient, then it's not really about regulation anymore. It's about control.